The day everything changed. I never imagined my sister's wedding would be the moment my entire world shifted. Looking back, the warning signs were there. I just hadn't paid attention. The first red flag? My invitation arrived only 4 days before the ceremony. The second? The words kitchen staff and trance only written in elegant gold script, with a hastily drawn arrow pointing to the back of the venue. Rachel, my older sister, had always been the golden child. While I dedicated my life to teaching underprivileged children, she climbed the corporate ladder with designer heels and a perfect manicure. Our parents never let me forget the difference between us. "Why can't you be more like your sisters?" Mom would sigh, eyeing my simple clothes and practical shoes with disappointment. "Look at her, engaged to Scott Ritter, CEO of Ritter Industries. And what do you have to show for yourself?" What they didn't understand was that I had plenty to show, just not in ways they valued. My small apartment wasn't impressive, but the joy on my students' faces when they finally understood a difficult lesson was worth more than any penthouse suite. Still, Rachel was my sister. No matter how distant she had grown since getting engaged to Scott, I told myself I had to be there. I put on my best dress, not designer, but elegant in its simplicity, and drove my aging Honda Civic to the Grand Plaza Hotel. At the main entrance, a security guard glanced at my invitation and pointed toward the back. "Service entrance only," he said curtly. I swallowed my pride and walked around the building, stepping through the bustling kitchen, dodging chefs and waiters rushing to prepare what was clearly an extravagant reception. The scent of fresh bread and seared steak filled the air, but all I could taste was the bitterness in my throat. A hostess intercepted me and led me to a small, nearly hidden table behind a massive pillar, far from the grand hall where the real celebration was taking place. Rachel's instructions were very clear, she said, shifting uncomfortably. Family members who might embarrass the couple should be kept out of sight. My hands trembled as I sat down, staring at the glittering chandeliers just out of reach. I had never felt more invisible. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just being excluded from the wedding. I was being erased. And I wasn't sure I could ever forgive her for it. I sat down, my fingers brushing against the tablecloth, thin, scratchy, and nothing like the fine linens covering the tables in the main hall. In front of me, a cheap plastic fork and knife rested on a flimsy napkin, starkly different from the gleaming silverware and fine china set before the other guests. My stomach tightened as I noticed a small folded note beside my plate. My sister's elegant handwriting curled across the paper in smooth, practiced strokes. "Know your place, little sister. Don't ruin this for me." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. My first instinct was to stand up, to leave, and never look back. I should have. I should have walked right out of that grand hotel and let Rachel have her perfect, polished wedding without me. But I stayed. Maybe it was stubbornness. The same stubbornness that made me choose teaching over the high-powered career my parents had pushed for. The same determination that made me believe I could carve my own path in a world that constantly reminded me I didn't quite fit. So I sat in my hidden corner, watching from the shadows as my sister floated down the aisle. The ceremony was breathtaking, of course. Rachel was stunning in a gown that likely cost more than my yearly salary, her veil catching the soft glow of the chandeliers. She moved with the grace of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for this moment, for this fairy tale ending. And waiting at the altar was Scott Ritter. Tall, distinguished, impeccably dressed in a custom tuxedo. He was handsome in that effortless, magazine cover way, the kind of man my mother would call a catch. The kind of man who belonged in my sister's world of wealth and influence. But something was wrong. As Rachel approached, his expression remained carefully composed, but his eyes held an emotion I couldn't quite place. He looked tense, almost uneasy. Then his gaze shifted, and he saw me. For a moment, the crowded room faded. The soft music, the whispered admiration, the quiet sniffles of teary-eyed guests, none of it existed. Just me. And him. Scott Ritter, CEO of Ritter Industries, locked eyes with me across the room. And then, in a moment so small yet so shocking, everything changed. He dropped his wedding ring. The golden band slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sharp ping, before rolling, coming to a stop right at my feet. I froze. Slowly, I bent down to pick it up. And as my fingers closed around the cool metal, memories I had long buried came rushing back. 17 years ago. A tiny coffee shop in New York. I was 19, juggling college classes and late-night shifts, dreaming of the day I would have my own classroom. He was 23, a regular customer who always ordered the same thing, black coffee, no sugar. But back then, he wasn't Scott Ritter, CEO. He was just Scott, a graduate student with big dreams and even bigger ideals. He wanted to change the world through ethical business practices. I wanted to teach. We spent 7 beautiful months together, lost in endless conversations about how we could combine our passions. Maybe we'd start a foundation for education. Maybe we'd travel. Maybe we'd make a difference together. And then he vanished. No explanation. No goodbye. Just gone. Now, 17 years later, Scott stood at the altar about to marry my sister. And as I stared down at the wedding ring in my hand, I knew. He remembered, too. I had searched for him. For weeks, months, until I finally had to accept the truth. It was as if he had never existed. No phone calls, no messages, not even a trace of his name, anywhere. And then, a year later, I saw his face again. There he was, staring back at me from the glossy pages of a business magazine. Scott Ritter, heir to Ritter Industries, engaged to a wealthy socialite. The words blurred as my heart shattered all over again. Now, standing in my sister's grand wedding hall, that same man, once my Scott, was looking at me like he'd seen a ghost. The golden wedding band lay cold in my palm, the weight of the past pressing down on me. "Scott," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the stunned silence. I held out the ring. The color drained from his face. Rachel, ever poised, arched one of her perfectly sculpted eyebrows. Confusion flickered across her features before twisting into irritation. "Scott, darling, do you know my pathetic little sister?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. But Scott wasn't looking at her. His gaze had fallen to my left hand, to the delicate silver ring I still wore. The same one he had given me 17 years ago in a tiny coffee shop in New York. The one engraved with the words, "To my Rebecca, who taught me what really matters." A sharp breath left his lips. "Rebecca," he murmured, and in that single word, I heard everything. Regret, sorrow, longing. 17 years of silence broken in an instant. Rachel's expression hardened. Her voice sharpened like the edge of a blade. "Scott, what is going on?" Before he could answer, a figure stirred from the front row. A distinguished older man rose to his feet, his presence commanding attention. Aaron Ritter Sr., the founder of Ritter Industries. His face was thunderous as he stepped toward the altar, his voice slicing through the air. "Son," he said, his tone low but powerful, "please tell me this isn't the same Rebecca?" The words hung over the room like a storm ready to break. The same Rebecca? Confusion twisted in my chest. What was he talking about? Scott squared his shoulders. And for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I once knew, the idealist, the dreamer, the Scott who had wanted to change the world. He lifted his chin and looked his father in the eye. "Yes, father," he said, his voice steady. "This is Rebecca. The woman you paid $10 million to disappear 17 years ago." Silence shattered. Gasps rippled through the room. Guests whispered in hushed, urgent tones. Some reached for their phones, recording the unfolding disaster. Rachel's perfect wedding was crumbling before her eyes. My sister's face turned an alarming shade of red, a color that clashed horribly with her pristine white gown. $10 million? The air seemed to vanish from my lungs. My knees felt weak as I turned to Scott, searching his face for the truth. And in his eyes, I saw it. 17 years ago, I hadn't been abandoned. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been erased. I rose slowly, my legs unsteady, my teacher's salary feeling like a fragile thread in a room woven with wealth and deception. "You paid me to disappear?" My voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of my words silenced the room. Aaron Ritter Sr. straightened his already perfect tie, his expression unreadable. "I paid your mother," he corrected, his voice smooth but cold. "She assured me you'd never contact Scott again. She said you agreed it was for the best." The air left my lungs. My mother. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity, her sudden insistence that I transfer universities that year, the mysterious deposit in my college fund, her constant reminders that Scott was out of my league. I turned to face her. She was shrinking into her chair, her carefully polished image cracking at the edges. "You knew," I said, my voice shaking. "You took money to separate us." She lifted her chin, her designer dress rustling as she stood. "It was for your own good," she said sharply. "Look at you, just a teacher living in a tiny apartment. Scott needed someone who understood his world. Rachel was perfect for him." "Perfect?" Scott let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Perfect for the company image, you mean? Just like that socialite you tried to set me up with after Rebecca left. Did you tell Rachel about that too, Father? How you've been controlling my relationships for 17 years. Rachel, who had been silent through the unraveling disaster, finally snapped out of her daze. "Scott, darling," she purred, her voice laced with desperation. "Surely, you're not comparing my worthless sister to me? I mean, look at her dress. It's not even designer."
Scott turned to me.
His expression softened, his voice quieter but firm.
"No," he said.
"It's handmade." A hush fell over the room. "Rebecca always said the most valuable things are made with love, not money." My throat tightened. He remembered. Rachel scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "This is ridiculous." But Scott wasn't finished. He turned back to his father, his voice dropping into something cold and controlled. "You have responsibilities," Aaron Ritter Sr. warned. "The merger with Rachel's father's company." Scott cut him off. "Is that what this wedding was really about, Father? Another business deal?" Rachel paled. "What do you mean, a business deal?" she demanded, her voice rising. Scott turned to her, his face unreadable. "Your father's company is failing," he said simply. "This marriage was meant to save it. That's why he pushed so hard for you to date me, isn't it?" A strangled sound escaped Rachel's throat. Her father shot up from his seat, his face red with anger. "Now see here." But Scott wasn't done. With calm precision, he reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small USB drive, holding it up between 3 fingers. "This," he said, voice steady, "proves everything." And in that moment, I knew Rachel's wedding was over. But our story? It was just beginning. Scott took a step forward, his voice strong and unwavering. "I found some interesting documents last week, Father, about what really happened 17 years ago. About the real reason you wanted Rebecca gone." Aaron Ritter Sr. turned pale. His carefully composed mask cracked, and for the first time that evening, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. "Scott, this isn't the time." "No," Scott interrupted, his voice cutting through the hushed room. "This is exactly the time." He turned to the stunned guests, his words carrying across the silent hall. "Rebecca wasn't just my girlfriend back then. She was also volunteering at a youth center in South New York. A youth center that was about to be demolished to make room for one of our developments, a project that would have displaced hundreds of families. I felt the weight of the past pressing down on me, memories surfacing like ghosts from the shadows. I remembered that fight, the protests, the petitions, the late nights spent organizing families, helping them stand up against the powerful corporation that wanted to push them out. And I remembered Scott by my side, listening, supporting, even suggesting alternative locations for the project. Back then, I had thought he believed in the fight, that he believed in me. Rebecca was leading the charge, Scott continued, his eyes locked onto his father. She was good at it, too. Too good. The media was starting to pay attention. If that development had failed, it would have cost the company millions. But more than that, it would have proven that Ritter Industries could be beaten. The room was deathly quiet. "That's why she had to go, isn't it, Father?" Aaron Ritter Sr. didn't respond. He simply sank into his chair, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. Scott exhaled, his voice cold as ice. So you paid her mother to make her disappear? A murmur rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned toward my mother, who was clutching her clutch bag so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Scott shook his head, disbelief and fury battling in his expression. You destroyed evidence of our relationship. You even donated to her new university to ensure she'd be accepted for a transfer. Everything, perfectly arranged. His father finally spoke, but his voice was weak. I did what was necessary for the company. Scott let out a bitter laugh. The company? Then he turned to the guests, his next words sending a fresh wave of shock through the room. The company that is now mine. Gasps erupted. Aaron Ritter Sr. sat up straighter, his shock unmistakable. Oh yes, Scott continued, his voice dripping with irony. As of last week, I'm the majority shareholder. Father signed over control as an early wedding gift. He let the word settle, then let out a quiet chuckle. Ironic, isn't it? A sharp gasp broke through the noise. Rachel. Scott, darling, you can't be serious, she squeaked, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his arm. We're supposed to be married. We're supposed to run this company together. Scott gently removed her hand from his sleeve, as if shaking off an afterthought. Then he walked toward me, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring my mother's horrified expression, ignoring the storm unraveling around us. I held my breath. Rebecca, he said softly, his eyes full of something I hadn't seen in 17 years, understanding. I spent all this time thinking you had abandoned me. 17 years trying to be the son my father wanted. Then last week I found these documents and I finally understood. He paused, his voice thick with something that sounded like regret. I was going to stop the wedding. But then I saw your name on the guest list, he swallowed, his jaw tightening, seated in the kitchen. I blinked, my heart pounding. And I knew, he continued, stepping even closer, that you deserved to hear the truth. From me? I could barely breathe. 17 years of betrayal. 17 years of lies. And now, for the first time, truth. The wedding was over. But the story was just beginning. I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head. Of course, I said. Rachel always did have a flair for drama. Scott turned to my sister, his expression calm but firm. The wedding's off, by the way, he announced. And you might want to check your father's company's financials before he tries to arrange another merger. Rachel let out a furious shriek and hurled her bouquet in our direction. She missed. Instead, the bouquet smacked into a champagne pyramid, sending dozens of crystal glasses shattering to the floor. Gasps echoed through the ballroom as champagne flooded the expensive marble tiles. But Scott barely glanced at the mess. He simply straightened his jacket and spoke over the chaos. As my first act as CEO, he declared, Ritter Industries is establishing a $200 million foundation for educational initiatives in underserved communities. The room erupted into stunned murmurs. Then Scott turned to me. We need a director who understands both education and community organizing, he said, his eyes searching mine. Interested? Before I could answer, my mother suddenly sprang up, her voice full of forced enthusiasm. Rebecca, darling, she gushed. I always knew you had potential. I turned to her, feeling nothing but exhaustion. Save it, I said flatly. I think you've helped enough for one lifetime. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but I was already looking back at Scott. The foundation job, I said, crossing my arms. Does it come with a corner office? A slow, familiar grin spread across his face. Only if you have dinner with me first, he said. I know this little coffee shop in New York. Something inside me softened. Rachel, still reeling, stomped her foot so hard that her designer heel nearly snapped. You can't do this, she shrieked. Daddy, do something. But her father wasn't listening. He was already rushing toward the exit, phone in hand, probably calling his accountant in a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of his empire. Aaron Ritter Sr., still seated at the front, stood up shakily. His face was pale, his voice rough. Son, he said, think about what you're doing. Scott turned to him, his hand closing gently around mine. Oh, I have, father, he said. For 17 years. He glanced at me, his grip warm and steady. The company's image could use some updating, don't you think? Less corporate greed, more social responsibility. His voice softened as he looked at me fully. Rebecca always said the measure of success isn't how much money you make, but how many lives you improve. Rachel let out another dramatic wail, but I barely heard her. Because at that moment, I was looking down at the small silver ring on my finger, the same one I had never taken off. The ring Scott had given me in a tiny coffee shop 17 years ago when we were just two kids with dreams bigger than the world would allow. Scott followed my gaze, then reached out, gently touching the band. "You kept it," he murmured, something raw in his voice. I met his eyes, a smile tugging at my lips. "You came back." And for the first time in 17 years, I felt like I had finally found my way home. "I do?" That was my answer. 7 months later, it was still true. The Ritterchen Educational Foundation had already funded 52 community programs, bringing resources, schools, and scholarships to underserved neighborhoods. Every time I saw a child walking into a classroom we helped build, every time a struggling student got the support they needed, I knew we were making a difference. Rachel, ever the survivor, landed on her feet, marrying a minor European prince who, ironically, had strong socialist beliefs. The last I heard, she was adjusting to a life of advocating for wealth redistribution while still enjoying designer shoes. My parents, realizing that philanthropy was now the family brand, suddenly became very interested in charitable giving. They made grand speeches about helping the less fortunate, though their invitations to family events mysteriously kept getting lost in the mail. Aaron Ritter Sr. quietly retired to a villa in France, stepping away from the empire he had spent his life building. To my surprise, he sent a letter, a real one, handwritten, not typed by an assistant. It was an apology, a real one. I framed it next to a newspaper article about the foundation's launch. The headline read, "From Corporate Scandal to Community Savior, How Ritter Industries is Redefining Success." I liked looking at it, not out of pride, but as a reminder. A reminder that people can change. That the right thing, once set in motion, has a way of building momentum. And as for me and Scott, we still go to that little coffee shop in New York. He still orders black coffee, no sugar. But now, when we talk about changing the world, we actually do it. The small silver ring I had worn for 17 years finally had a companion, a simple gold band that matched it perfectly. Inside, an inscription written in Scott, familiar hand. To my Scott, who came back to what really matters. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting it right.